in chapters 26 and 27. All right, 2 Chronicles chapter 26 begins the story of King Uzziah. And last week we looked at his father, Amaziah, who we're told did a lot of good things, at least in the beginning, but that verse 25 and verse 2, he didn't do them with a loyal heart, which is really kind of the key idea of the book of 2 Chronicles, what we do matters, but it's the loyalty of our heart that God is looking at as well, and kind of what does it take to develop a loyal heart. And so Amaziah is the one who did a bunch of good things until after he defeated the Edomites, and then he began to worship the God of the Edomites, even though that makes no sense. And so, kind of feeling big in his britches, he tried to fight Israel, the northern country, and lost, and later was assassinated. And so as we pick up in chapter 26 and verse 1, it says that all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and he made him king instead of his father Amaziah. Now, that's a little different wording, if you noticed. Usually, it describes it a little bit differently. For example, if you go back to chapter 21 and verse 1, it says, Jehoshaphat rested with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And then Jehoram, his son, reigned in his place. And usually it sort of describes the death there in that first sentence, but this says that he was made king instead of his father. And I just want to put that out there. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. But he is a 16-year-old boy, and we're told in, let's see here, verse 2, it says, he built Elath and restored it to Judah. And after the king rested with his fathers, I read that funny. He built Elath and restored it to Judah after the king rested with his fathers. And Uzziah was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. And so he's a 16-year-old boy when he becomes king. His mother is a Jew, which, we've seen historically. That doesn't always work out, but usually if their mother is not from a different country, then that works out better for them. And it seems likely that for a time period, he was sort of a co-regent with his father, which kind of helps explain how he served for 52 years, such a long reign. That probably his father was still alive when he began to be king. And if you go back to chapter 25 and verse 25, it says, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, lived 15 years after the death of Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel. And so what had happened was he tried to have battle with the northern kingdom, and he was captured. But then they clarifying that that's not the end of his life when he was captured. It says that he lived 15 years after the northern king died. And so after this battle, he lives for quite some time. And then in verse 27, it says, after the time that Amaziah turned away from following the Lord, they made a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem, and he fled to Lachish. But they sent after him to Lachish, and they killed him there. And that all sounds like it was probably, a short time period. But remember, he stopped following the Lord whenever he put the gods up of the Edomites. And then he lived more than 15 years after that happened. And so likely quite some time takes place between the first part of verse 27 and the second part of verse 27. And so it seems very likely that this boy was reigning even when his father was still alive. And it kind of sounds like that even, in verse 1, they made him king instead of his father. And then in verse 2, they tell us the things that he did after the king rested. And so you see, he didn't start this, even though he was king, he didn't start these projects until after his father died.
That start of that chapter, you think, well, why was his father not king? And then you go back to
right.
The previous chapter, and you find it,
he was, yes. And there was sort of a rebellion of sorts, kind of, and they just kind of put his son in his place, even though he wasn't dead yet. And eventually they did kill him, but it seems he hid out in Lachish for quite some time, kind of in an exile. In verse 2, we're told that he built Elath, and that's always a significant thing for the kings. Now, if you can picture the nation of Israel, and you've got the Jordan River on one side, and as you get to the bottom, that's where the Red Sea is, the Salt Sea that they talk about, that you can kind of float on if you go and visit it today. And if you keep going way farther south, you get into the country of the Edomites, and those are the descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother. They lived way far to the south of there, all the way down to what's called now the Gulf of Aqaba, which is another giant sort of lake. And so when Solomon was king, he conquered all of that territory of the Edomites all the way down to this Gulf, which it eventually gets to the sea. And so that opens up a lot of trade for their country because they can go through that Gulf and into the sea. And so whenever one of the kings after Solomon has control of that area, that tells you something about his blessings from God, that he was able to take that back over. Remember in chapter 25, we're told that Amaziah went in verses 11 and 12, and he went to the Valley of Salt, and he killed 10,000 of the people of Seir. Seir is another name for Edom. And also they took captive 10,000 alive and killed all of them by throwing them off the top of a cliff. And so when he was still righteous, he conquered these people. Very shortly after, he still has his son is the king, and they still have access of this area. And then if you go back, for example, to chapter 20, in chapter 20 and verses 35 to 37, in chapter 20, starting in verse 35, it says, after this Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, allied himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who acted very wickedly. Right? This was Jehoshaphat's one problem. He kept trying to be friends with the northern kingdom because it seemed like he was trying to teach them the truth, kept working with them. And he allied himself with them to make ships to go to Tarshish, and they made ships in Ezion Geber. Now that's the same place as Elam. Ezion Geber, Elam, same place. But there was a prophecy, and it says, because you have allied yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has destroyed your works. And then the ships were wrecked so that they were not able to go to Tarshish. And so he lost the ships, but you see he has that territory of the Edomites because he's a good king. And then likewise in chapter 21 in verses 8 through 10, Jehoram is in charge now. He's a wicked king. And it says, in his days, Edom revolted against Judah's authority and made a king over themselves. And it goes on to describe how he lost the battle and he lost that territory. And so whenever you see these mentions of Edom or Elath or Ezion Geber in the time period of the kings, that is a clue. Is this a righteous king or is it not a righteous king? Because only the righteous kings tended to maintain control over the Edomite territory. And you notice there's a contrast here. His father conquered the Edomites, and then he comes back, and what does he do? He sets up the Edomites' gods as his own, and then he tries to go into more battle, right? He's greedy for more, so he tries to defeat the kings of the north, and he fails. Meanwhile, his son takes over, and instead of going into battle, what does he do? He builds, right? It says in verse 2, he built up Elath, the territory that his father conquered. He's building it up. Now, if his father had conquered the Edomites and not started worshiping the gods of Edom, and instead had been spending his time building up Elath to increase the trade, that would have been a better use of his time. He didn't have that wisdom, though, because of his greed. So you already, right from the start, verse 2, you get a strong sense of there's a big difference between Amaziah and Uzziah. There's a big difference between the two. One of them was greedy and just kept trying to get into wars. The other one says, we have this territory, let's do something good with it. Let's build it up. And we're told that he has a loyal heart. In verse 4, it says, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He means when he was still righteous, not afterwards, of course. He sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the visions of God. And as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. And so we get a little foreshadowing there. Clearly there's troubles ahead because it says, in the days of this one man, he was faithful. So there is trouble ahead, but he says that he did seek after God. And it's not just the works of God, but he sought after God himself, and that he did what was right. And so there's a weakness in his faith, but he has a loyal heart. And you go back to 2 Kings, when it talks about him in 2 Kings, it doesn't say nearly as much in 2 Kings chapter 15. 2 Kings chapter 15, and starting in verse 3, it just says, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all his father Amaziah had done, except that the high places were not removed, and the people still sacrificed and burn incense in the high places. And so it does tell us in verse 5 about some bad things that happened to him, but it doesn't say that he was a wicked king himself. And they're always built, he's either wicked or he's righteous. And so when we put all of this together, what we get is he does make some bad mistakes, but that overall God considers Uzziah a righteous king, although there are certainly consequences for his actions. In verses 6 through 8, we see that unlike his father, he makes war in humility, and that ultimately is going to kind of be the point of these two chapters, is a loyal heart stays humble. It's one thing to be humble, but a loyal heart continues to be humble. It stays humble. And so he starts out in verses 6 through 8, and he makes war in humility. It says he went out and he made war against the Philistines. He broke down the wall of Gath, the wall of Jabneh, and the wall of Ashdod. He built cities around Ashdod and among the Philistines. But notice, God helped him. That's why he was successful. He was humble. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians who lived in Gur-baal and against the Meunites. Also, the Ammonites brought tribute to Uzziah, and he doesn't seem to even go to battle with these people. They just hear about his success, and they say, let's just get on his good side, And so they bring him tribute. It says his fame spread as far as the entrance of Egypt, for he became exceedingly strong. And that's always that kind of cringe phrase of, is he going to stay humble, or is he going to become proud after this? But his fame is because, verse 7, God helped him. He makes war in humility. He builds up Jerusalem and Judah in humility. Verse 9, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and at the corner buttress of the wall. And then he fortified them. And he built towers in the desert, the deserted places. He dug many wells, for he had much livestock, both in the lowlands and the plains. He also had farmers and vine dressers in the mountains and in Carmel. And this is interesting. I can't think of another person in Scripture that this is said about. It says, for he loved the soil. That's kind of an interesting little note about him here. And I think it does give you a sense of his humbleness. He's not just a war-minded king. He's not just a conquering, right? He's someone who goes out and he waters his plants. He has an interest in agriculture, and in the dirt is a low thing, right? And the so-called low things, not that there's anything low about it, but just he's interested in getting his hands dirty, like what kids do and stuff. He loves the soil, and so he's interested in these things. In verses 11 through 15, we see he builds defenses in humility. He says Uzziah had an army of fighting men. Now he describes it here, and it's unusual for kings to keep an army in times of peace. But he has a time of peace, and he has this big army. It shows you how great his blessings are. He had an army of fighting men who went out to war by companies, according to the number on their roll, as prepared by Jeiel the scribe and Maaseiah the officer, under the hand of Hananiah, one of the king's captains. And the total number of chief officers of the mighty men of valor was 2,600. Their armies just grow with each good king. Under their authority was an army of 307,500 that made war with mighty power to help the king against the enemy. And Uzziah prepared for them for the entire army. Now, so often, you go back to King Saul, only Saul and Jonathan had weapons and shields. Nobody else did. And so often they send these men into battle and they don't really have sufficient weapons or armor. But he says in verse 14, he prepared for the entire army. If you were in his army, you had it all. Shields, spears, helmets, body armor, bows, and slings to cast stones. He made devices in Jerusalem. He's a very interesting person. That I don't think it says this about anybody else in Scripture either. He made devices in Jerusalem and invented by skillful men to be on towers and the corners, to shoot arrows, and I think he's describing catapults, to shoot large stones at incoming armies or whoever it is. And so his fame spread far and wide, for he was marvelously helped. Who is marvelously helping him? God. He's a humble man. God is with the humble. He will lift them up. This king has been lifted higher than any king so far as these kinds of things go. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know how much time passes with what we're reading right now.
Sure.
Days, weeks, months, years,
likely years, yeah.
Yeah, but one thing you don't see this whole time is praising God. You
Sure.
don't ever see him. I mean, I'm not saying he didn't,
Right.
but in other places, you see where some of these prophets or kings or so forth, when good things are happening,
Mhm.
they call the congregation together
Mhm.
and they sing praises or they praise God or they do things like that. And you don't see
It's
anything.
absent,
You
at
don't
least.
see that again.
Mhm.
Not to say that's not there, and then you're about to get to it. But the one time he does go, it's mentioned he does it with and I guess in my opinion, arrogant. You're talking about being humble,
Yes.
but in my opinion, because we know that only the priests can go into the
Right.
God, and so the way I look at it, well, I've done all these things, I can go in here as well.
Mhm.
So you don't see that attitude. Not that
That's
it's not there,
that's true.
but it's glaring that you don't see anything mentioned
Mhm.
about praising God, being thankful for God.
That old saying comes back, absolute power corrupts absolute, and that's what's going to happen.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And we do see that there are some kings who have that kind of power who withstand the temptation, but most of them don't. Yeah, you're right about that. And I think that that's true. And really, we're not given any dialogue. He doesn't say good or bad, one way or another. And because we're told that he was right in the sight of the Lord. We can assume that there was a time in his life where he was humble and likely did praise God. But perhaps that is intentional. That you don't see that, and it does build a very strong contrast with what you do see when you get into the second part of the chapter. You're not really, okay,
I
yeah.
just think that, later on in the New Testament,
Mhm.
he talks about in Romans when it says, neither were they thankful. That's always,
Yes.
always in my head of, did I stop and thank God for these things
Yes.
that are happening?
Yeah.
Because, you don't ever get too big for your britches.
That's
so to
right.
speak.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. And so, yeah, he is just, it says he was marvelously helped. God marvelously helped him. And so you do get the picture that in the beginning, you have this very humble kind of person. And then it says in verse 15, until he became strong. Now, notice, and we pointed this out before, but I think it's important. He was already strong in the sense that his kingdom was very strong. It was not wrong for him to build up the towers and the army. It was not wrong for him to put catapults at the top of the towers. It wasn't wrong for him to help the farmers. To strengthen the kingdom was what they were supposed to do. And when it says he became strong, it's talking about his pride. As he grew his kingdom, his pride grew with it. And that's where the trouble comes in, because other kings did make their kingdom strong, but they stayed humble and they didn't get the trouble. And so whenever it says until he became strong, it's really hinting that it's because pride came into it. And that's what verse 16 tells us. It says, when he was strong, his heart was lifted up. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. But pride comes before a fall. If you lift yourself up, humility, and not the kind that you choose, but the kind that's forced on you, humility is what follows. He says, he was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God. And it's his destruction because it's a particularly grievous sin. It's kind of above and beyond what some of the previous kings had done. By entering the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. And so he
That was priest's job, right?
That's the priest's job. That's right. And so he stumbles over this temptation. All right, that's pride leads to a fall. Because in some religions of the people that surrounded them, and that's what Moses had told them. The religions around you will cause some of you to stumble. In some of the religions of the people around them, the king also had priestly duties, and so the king was in charge. And he also had the honor of going into their gods' temples and burning incense or performing sacrifices or things like that. And so that's, in a way, you could look at that and say he's thinking their kings have more honor than I do, and I'm the greatest kingdom in the world at the moment. I have catapults. No one's had that before. That's really cool. So he's got all of this greatness, but he's noticing other kings have more honor than he does. And he has a desire for that. And so he says he entered the temple to burn incense on the altar of incense. And Azariah, now this is interesting because Uzziah is his name, but in 2 Kings, he's called Azariah at the beginning of the chapter. 2 Kings 15, his name is Azariah, and his name is changed later to Uzziah. And so the high priest and the king have the same name, It says, Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him were 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men, and they withstood King Uzziah, and they said to him, It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. And again, this is another theme that comes up over and over. You shall have no honor from the Lord God. And so there's no honor for the proud. All right. Now, Azariah is the priest, and from here he's going to sort of be the true leader of the nation, I think, for a little while at least. And his name, Azariah's name, means God has helped. God has helped him. And remember, that's what Uzziah's name was originally. And isn't that what it says about him over and over again? Verse 7, God helped him. Verse 15, he was marvelously helped. His name originally meant God helped. Uzziah means strength of God. Strength of God. Now that sounds like a positive thing because you have God's strength. And they did this often, when they renamed people who did bad things, it was sort of mocking. It's more like saying he believed he had the strength of a God. In essence, he started to think of himself way too highly, which is exactly what happens. And it's kind of interesting because if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 15, I can't say this for certain, but there's reason to believe that you can pinpoint the moment when they started calling him Uzziah. Because it starts in chapter 15, and we're told, in the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, the son of Amaziah, became king. Right? That's the same man as Uzziah, but they called him Azariah. God has helped. And in verse 8, we're told that in the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah, this man named Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel. And so 38 years in, he's still called Azariah. But in verse 13, we're told that Shallum, the son of Jabesh, became king, and that's of the northern kingdom, in the 39th year of Uzziah. And this is the first time Scripture ever calls him that, the 39th year of Uzziah. And so I'm thinking, and like I said, I can't say this definitively, it seems like something happened between year 38 and year 39 that they had reason to give him a different name, from God has helped to one who thinks he has the strength of a God in essence. And then if you add to that Amos chapter 1 and verse 1, Amos chapter 1 and verse 1, I always have trouble finding Amos. He's tucked back there in those minor prophets. Amos chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, the words of Amos, who was among the sheep breeders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah. So he's writing after all these things take place. In the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And actually, this earthquake was something that apparently was catastrophic. I mean, people remembered it for hundreds of years. It's mentioned again in the book of Zechariah, chapter 14 and verse 5, the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. That was a couple hundred years after this, but people still remembered what was apparently a devastating earthquake. And it says that he was preaching 2 years before the earthquake when Uzziah and Jeroboam were both kings. Well, Jeroboam, he dies. Let's see here. If you go back to 2 Kings chapter 15, go to 1429. 1429. Jeroboam dies. He rested with his fathers, the king of Israel, and Zechariah, his son, reigned in his place. Now, Zechariah, in 15:8, came to power in the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah. And so he dies about a year before Uzziah sins in the way that he does. And so Amos prophesies 2 years before the earthquake. That puts in the right time frame. Jeroboam dies in the year before the earthquake. And so it seems very likely that this earthquake happens in the 39th year of Uzziah's reign, the same year that he sinned. Now, I think that's significant because ancient people believed earthquakes were sent from God as a consequence of some kind of sin or something like that. And there is this sin that is so big that God sends a devastating earthquake that people talked about for hundreds of years, the same year, most likely, that Uzziah goes into the temple and tries to act like he is a priest instead of a king. And I think you ask yourself, well, why is that such a big deal? Someday there would be a man who, in God's authority, is both priest and king. And of course, it's today. Jesus the Christ is both priest and king. And you have this man Uzziah trying to be both priest and king. Now, again, I'm pulling together some things that we can't say for certain, but I think there's good evidence to believe that earthquake happened that one year. Yes, sir.
Just to lesson us how he didn't fall.
Yes, I think so. I mean, you really do. You have all the image of really a good man, and don't forget that in verse 5 it said that he sought God in the days of Zechariah. And clearly, sometime around when he falls is when Zechariah either dies or he no longer has access to him in some way. And you do a little bit perhaps have a man whose faith is a little dependent on somebody else, just like Joash was. But I think you're right. It's very easy to fall. And so we left off in verse 18 when he says, "You shall have no honor." And notice Uzziah's response, right? This is not like David, who, when confronted with sin, always repented. And it says Uzziah became furious, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priest, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord beside the incense altar. Right? And so he thinks the priest is wrong, or he just doesn't want the priest to be right. He's furious. He's not willing to repent. And so leprosy breaks out on his head. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and there on his forehead he was leprous. And so they thrust him out of that place. Right there, he has to get out. You can't be in the house of the Lord with leprosy. It's unclean. And indeed, he's humbled. He also hurried to get out because the Lord had struck him. And so King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death, and he dwelt in an isolated house. He is still the king, but he can't do all the things. He can't go to the temple ever again to worship God. He can never again go to the throne room to sit on his throne and serve as king. Just like his father, who was ran away because they were trying to kill him and was separated from all of that for 15 years or so. He is separated from all of that because of his pride, because of his sin. Yes, sir.
He feared the priest, or he would have probably thrown them in jail or something like that, or crucified them.
Yeah, I don't know, but oh right. Well, I think he was angry. He was probably going to take action, but it just broke out on his head all of a sudden. And you're right. After it broke out on his head, he was terrified. It says he ran. And so he can't worship in the temple. He can't rule effectively. He can't be with his family anymore. I mean, he lost all of that in a moment because his pride became too big. And so it says he was cut off from the house of the Lord. And then Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. And so Jotham was probably about 11 years old when he became sort of co-regent with his father. And that, I think, you think, well, who's helping this 11-year-old boy? Again, probably Azariah the priest. And he's probably the sort of the de facto leader at this time. And the rest of the acts of Uzziah, from first to last, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amoz, wrote. And so Uzziah rested with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of burial, which belonged to the kings, for they said he is a leper. And so he's not exactly, condemned to the level of some of them. Some of them, they buried him in the city, but not in the tombs of the fathers. But this one, it says they buried him in the tombs of his fathers, or at least in a field close to it. They said he's a leper, so we can't put him in the tomb with the other kings. And so he's sort of in between. He's not condemned as fully as the others, but he couldn't go into the actual tomb of the kings. They said, because he's a leper, we're going to put him in this field. And Jotham, his son, raised in his place. They got him as close as they could get. And remember, overall, he is billed as a righteous king. And for most of the time that he was ruling, he was a righteous person. But such big consequences from one action. We must be careful. We must stay humble, because any one of us could do something catastrophic in a moment of self-important pride. Any comments or anything on Uzziah? Thank you. Yeah. All right, so we're now going to look at chapter 27. It's a short chapter. Chapter 27, and this is about King Jotham. And so if Uzziah became leprous in his 39th year, then Jotham was a co-regent about 14 years, starting when he was about 11 years old. And you see a lot of possible good influences in his life. There's Azariah the priest. We're told in verse 1 that his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. If you look at the name Zadok in the Bible, every instance of the name Zadok in the Bible except for one, and there's a bunch of Zadoks, but every instance of Zadok is a Levite. So it's very possible, can't say for certain, but it's very possible that his mother comes from a Levite family and his grandfather is a Levite. And so you have the priest, you have the Levites, and don't forget, you very possibly have the earthquake that made a big impact on this 11-year-old boy after his father sins in the way that he does. And so we're told that he was 25 years old when he became king, and I'm thinking that's after his father finally dies and they officially make him king. And he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah had done, except, right, they were going to clarify that, although he did not enter the temple of the Lord, but still the people acted corruptly. And that's an interesting kind of thing, that he is righteous himself. He's a good king, but there are wicked people. He's not able to influence the people to be righteous themselves. And so, maybe he's not as zealous as Jehoshaphat. Remember, Jehoshaphat's the one that sent out teachers 2 by 2 to convince the people. Maybe he's not quite that zealous, or maybe he is, and they're just an extremely kind of corrupt and wicked people. But it just goes to show that sometimes you can have excellent leaders, and that just doesn't mean anything as far as the people go. If people are stubborn, they're just not going to follow sometimes. You can't always blame the leaders for what the people choose to do. And I think that that's the case here. And so also, just as an interesting fact, they have discovered a signet ring in Israel that has his name on it from this time period. It's actually his son Ahab's ring. It's his royal seal, but his name is on this. And so sometimes they do discover interesting little things that have evidence, that corroborates exactly what the Bible tells us. And there's and that's right, King Uzziah's name was also discovered on a royal seal somewhere. And so they have a seal somewhere that has his name that fits this time period in history. It kind of corroborates what we know to be true. And so Jotham humbly builds up Jerusalem. Verse 3, he built the upper gate of the house of the Lord, and he built extensively on the wall of Ophel. Moreover, he built cities in the mountains of Judah, and in the forest he built fortresses and towers. He humbly wages battle. Verse 5, he also fought with the king of the Ammonites and defeated them. And the people of Ammon gave him in that year 100 talents of silver, 10,000 cores of wheat, 10,000 of barley. And the people of Ammon paid this to him in the 2nd and 3rd years also. So that's, some archaeologists and historians say that the most wealthy kings in the world at this time were paid about the same amount. He would have been one of the most wealthiest kings in all of the world, just based on what the Ammonites gave him, not including possibly even other people. And he's very strong, but he's humble. Verse 6, so Jotham became mighty. He became strong because he prepared his ways before the Lord his God. And so, unlike his father, this is an intentional, he chooses God. He seeks God each day with humility. This is what his intention is. This is what he does. And so Jotham is greatly blessed, as any king or as any person is, if they choose to intentionally and humbly each day seek out the Lord his God. And it finishes in verse 7. It says, the rest of the acts of Jotham and all his wars and his ways, indeed they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And Jotham rested with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David, and Ahaz his son reigned in his place. And so when your actions are about God and for God, when what you do is about God and for God, humility is possible even when you have great success. And I know sometimes when you read these accounts, it can kind of feel like, well, don't be successful, because if you're successful, you'll be proud, and then that's the fall, right? But this man is successful because his actions are always, he keeps choosing to make them about God and for God. Success does not have to mean pride. It just depends on you. And so he was honored for a loyal life of humility. I think as we close and think about this, for Uzziah, his humility and success was possible as long as Zechariah was around. As long as Zechariah was there, he could stay humble in his success. And so the question is, for each of us to ask is, who does my humility depend upon? Who does my faith depend upon? Is there a spouse or an elder or another Christian that I depend on to help me to stay humble? Because if that's the case, it's a dangerous place to be. And sometimes when we're starting off, we have to borrow from other people, but that's a dangerous place to stay in, because something is going to happen to them someday. They're going to move away, they're going to fall away, they're going to die, something is going to happen. And where does that leave you? We've seen twice now. That always leads to terrible, terrible consequences. And so it's better to be like Jotham. His humility was based on God. He received his humility from God because he trusted and depended on God. And so that even when other people, right, even when your children, even when anybody else become corrupt, I remember chapter 27 and verse 2, still the people acted corruptly. That's why the previous two kings fell. Whenever the person they depended on was gone, the people came to them and they said, we don't want to do this anymore. And so they didn't do that anymore. Yes, ma'am.
What was the reason that, it appears, and I'll just surface reading, it appears that, the reason that people didn't, they acted corruptly is because he didn't cut down the high places.
Mm-hmm.
Did he not have the power to do that?
And that's a lot of the kings don't do it, and they're still called righteous kings, but it is sort of written as, but like they really should have done this. And really, it seems like it could vary from occasion to occasion. And in some instances it seems like they really could have, but they just didn't think that it was worth the effort or the struggle.
It's the same way as our government today. We have people in offices that do good, but yet the influence of those that they would have to butt heads with, they don't want to put out the effort. And I think these kings didn't want to butt heads with those that had the influence in those areas.
I think a lot of times that's the case. And, like you said, we can't say for certain about each one of them because it doesn't normally give a reason, especially for the righteous ones. But it says that they're righteous. And so it's not exactly holding it against them. But it does always point it out. And I think it points it out because some of them do get rid of it. And those are the most praised. Those are praised more than anyone. And so it's very much, God would prefer that happened. And I think really what you're looking at sometimes is those high places that they kept worshiping at, they weren't under a good king. They weren't always even worshiping other gods. Sometimes they're worshiping the true God there, but God had said there is one place where you can do, the sacrifices and those kinds of things. And so they're still worshiping God, but they're not exactly doing it according to his standard. And yes, sir.
Not that this matters, but those high places still, you want to look at the politics of it. Those high places were, there was taxation on those things. So what was brought to what was brought to those places, the king or the government or which had their portion of
could be
what was brought to it. And so there was probably like I said, there was everything that I read as far as history. There was taxation on that, and
could be.
So he the kings they were profiting from these high places, and so even though you're even in today, you see some some of the things that go on, some bad practices go on. Well, the reason it's going on is, hey, taxes. We want to allow. What's the biggest issue today? One of the biggest issues today is to allow illegal drugs. Let's allow illegal drugs so that we can tax it and make money off of it. And I think the same thing was probably going on at that time.
Could be, yeah. At the least, I think, they at least don't want to ruffle feathers, and perhaps there is some profit for them in it. And whatever it is, they had to have a strong faith to do it, because the righteous kings who seem to have maybe a little less, they don't do it, and it does cause more problems for them and for their children and so forth and so on. So that's a good question.
Well, back we was talking about God helped them to be whatever, I forgot what word it used. For he had to, in being a good leader, he had to be good to his people for them to love him enough to stay in order for all of that to take place.
Yes, and that's kind of you're good to your people, but in what way are you good? And those that were good to their people by letting them do what they wanted, it eventually led to some kind of rebellion anyway. But those who were good to their people by following God's standards, which included getting rid of some things, but also, God's laws were very protective of the hungry and the widow and the orphan and so forth. And so when you do it all according to God's standards, those are the kings that really had it best and had the most blessing. And I think Uzziah is such a helpful example of that, because he had it more than anyone when he was doing it God's way. And it seemed like he really was doing it God's way to the utmost. But he's kind of like the Apostle Paul in reverse. And, whatever he does, he seems to do it all the way. We're going to build towers. We're putting catapults on the top of them. We're going to help the farmers out. We're doing all of it. And that's, you talk about he loved the soil. That was a big part of their agricultural law, was leaving the edges to provide for the poor. They could go and get a little bit of food for themselves, and to protect those who didn't have as much. He's doing all of that stuff. But then, like the Apostle Saul or Paul, when he switches, he goes all the way, and he does it to the extreme. Just Saul went from wrong to right, and Uzziah went from right to wrong. And he seems to be kind of a full throttle kind of guy, and it's just such a shame that he was full throttle in the wrong direction. So, all right, was there another hand over here? All right, well, as we were saying, in 27 and verse 2, he was faithful even when the people acted corruptly. And I think we see this a lot in the church and in families. People are faithful until their grown children don't want to be faithful anymore, and then people start to make compromises. Or the church is faithful, the elders are faithful, until enough of the people or enough of the wealthy people don't want to do things that way anymore, and then the elders say, well, we could make some changes. And Jotham shows us that just because the people that you're responsible for or the people that you care for don't want to do the right thing, you can have the kind of faith that does the right thing anyway, and that really is your best bet at convincing them. If you compromise, they think they're right. But if you keep on doing what's right, you give them a chance to see how it all works out. And Lord willing, they have long enough to make that change. And that's a hard thing. But Jotham shows us that that's the right path for him, because he had such a blessed kingship under God, because he just kept on doing it, even though others didn't want him to. He just kept on doing the right thing. All right, we will wrap it up there then and pick up next week with the colorful King Ahaz.